Hey, gang. Welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio, where we talk about the Beatles exclusively here on this channel. And with me this time is a guest we had on recently. It's Michael Ventrella. Michael put out this book called The Beatles on the Charts. And we talked a lot about all the information that's in this book. And also, as someone who has been a charts guy my whole life, and Michael and I shared the experience of growing up and listening to Casey Kasem's American Top 40, writing down the top 40 charts every single week, rooting for our favorite songs, especially the solo Beatles singles. We have a similarity there. And so I'm sure this was a labor of love for him. This book includes all the information about the Beatles group and solo records, singles and albums, how far they went on the charts, how many weeks they spent on the charts, and even at the back of the book, it takes you week by week where each single and album was on the charts, and you can find out singles and albums that were on the charts simultaneously when it comes to Beatles and solo Beatle music. Anyway, enough of my yakking. Michael, welcome back.
Thanks for inviting me back. I appreciate it.
One of the things that we talked about when we had you on was the way that Billboard comes up with this information. You actually list what are the biggest singles of all time and what are the biggest albums of all time. And you combined the group and the solo together. You didn't separate the two for this. And the way that the point system has worked with Billboard, for those of you that don't fully understand this, but every single week that a song or an album is on the charts, it gets a certain number of points. In the Hot 100, if a song was at number 100 for that week, it gets 1 point. If it's at 99, it gets 2 points. And so you add every single week where it was on the charts, you add all the points together. And the way that Billboard worked was that if a song went to number 1, it would get not only 100 points, it would get 100 points for being number 1, but would it get an additional 100 on top of that?
Yes.
Okay. See, that I agree with, but correct me on this. If a song was number 1 for more than 1 week, did it only get the 100 additional points once, or does it get it every time?
Every time.
Okay. So in other words, Hey Jude being number 1 for 9 weeks got 900 points more.
Exactly. 900 extra points on top of what it would normally get anyway.
Okay, great. So when you put this book together, you didn't agree with that.
Correct.
With that system. What was the reason behind that?
Mainly because it didn't seem fair to the song that might have gotten to number 2. As far as I'm concerned, if you got to number 2, that's a pretty good accomplishment. And for all I know, it sold 1 less copy than number 1 that week. So it didn't seem fair that number 1 should get all this extra bonus. And, something that got number 1 week might run down to number 2 the next week and still sell more than it did the week before, because it doesn't, it compares with everything else that was selling that week. So to me, giving a bonus just didn't seem fair to the other songs that did really close, that got to number 2 and got to number 3. It seemed to slight them as if they weren't getting the treatment that they needed to get. So I didn't do that. Now, mind you, had I done it that way, the charts would have looked quite differently. And in some ways, I kind of regret doing that, although I'm not sure I would do it over if I did it again, Matt. Because what happens is, especially in the early days of the Beatles, songs zoomed up the charts and zoomed back down the charts. And so when I put my thing together, they didn't score as high. Whereas if I had given them points for being at 100, they'd score much higher, and people would say, oh, that makes a lot more sense. For example, if I can give you an example, in my book, Yesterday zoomed up the charts, stayed at number 1 for 4 weeks, and then zoomed right back down again and was at number 51. However, if I had given them the points, they would have been at number 23. Because if they had gotten the extra points for being at number 1 for 4 weeks.
See, I can see your logic, but I can also, the way I look at it, the way Billboard has done it seems to me to be the most logical, because a song that was number 1 for 2 weeks is a bigger hit to me than a song that was number 1 for 1 week. And so the point system should reflect that. That's the way I look at it anyway. But going by what Billboard does and what you do, if a song has the longevity, if it stays on the charts for half a year or something close to a year, and as we pointed out in our previous show, there were songs, especially in the 70s, that stayed on the charts forever.
Oh
Like
yeah.
I go crazy. We,
Right, you mentioned that
from
right. The fact that
yeah.
you recognized that as soon as I said it told me, oh yeah,
Oh,
this guy definitely kept the charts.
yeah. I was writing down the top 40 every single
Yeah,
week. And Always and Forever from Heat
yeah.
Wave, which just inched up week after week after week, but stayed on the charts for a very long time. So because of that, they deserve all those points that they had. But the way that you had your book here, to me, there's no question in my mind. Hey Jude should be the number one song.
And if we had
You know,
done it the way the Billboard done it, it would have been
yeah,
absolutely. It would have been number one, just like Starting Over, which is number one in my book, would have been number three.
right. So I'm glad that you are making, well, at least you put together a list with these changes. Would you
Mhm.
consider revising your book and adding the new information?
I would, if nothing else, I would revise the book and add that as an addendum, even if I don't change the book itself. I think that's a good for people to see the list. For people like you who said, well, what if you gave it the same way the Billboard did it? If I was going to revise the book, it's not going to happen anytime too soon. Maybe, I hate to say it, but when Paul and Ringo are gone, I'll revise it because then there won't be any more, solo albums coming out.
Mm.
But hopefully that's not going to happen anytime too soon.
And you could always have archival albums on the charts again,
That's
as we've
true.
known so many times with the Beatles. you
Yeah,
know,
Abbey Road's still on the charts. The last time I looked, it's they're still selling, guys. There's a reason the Beatles are still selling.
yeah. And one of the reasons why I love this information is that, and believe me, there are flaws in Billboard's charts, as we talked about before. The biggest of which, and I'll only mention this because I can go on and on about this, is that when the Beatles CDs first came out in 1987, Please Please Me was released, With the Beatles was released for the first time in America, the British albums, but it
Mhm.
came out on CD. It was the event of the year, the Beatles on CD, and it wasn't on their album charts. And
No, they
how
had a
could that
separate
be?
chart. I
Yes.
know. No, you're right. They had a separate chart for like, archival or stuff or whatever they called it back then. I don't remember what term they used, which was ridiculous.
I think it
Sell it,
was
it's on the top four, top chart.
I think it was pop catalog album chart,
Catalog. Yeah,
something like
that's it.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just imagine where these albums would rank if it was done the same way from the very beginning. I mean, all those Beatles albums from the moment that they came out on CD, which was, like I said,
Yeah.
so eventful, would have a lot more weeks on the charts. They'd be ranking higher.
Hmm.
And, same thing like what I said about the Christmas charts and
Exactly.
there not being a Christmas chart for many years.
Right. And that's a key. Happy Christmas and Wonderful Christmas Time showed up on the Christmas charts almost every year, but they didn't count them on the Billboard charts until just a couple of years ago.
Right.
Makes sense.
So if it stayed that way from the very beginning, Happy Christmas could be the number one single of all time, or Wonderful Christmas Time, depending upon how well it would have done when they
Yeah.
first came out and in the ensuing years after that. So, yeah. So before we get to our main topic of the show, which is you're going to list your top 5 favorite Beatles albums of all time.
Yes.
I always like doing this every now and then with my guests because I love hearing different opinions and love hearing it from historians and musicians and authors in your case. Before we do that, maybe you can just highlight when it comes to singles and albums with this change when you added those bonus 100 points for
Mhm.
the singles and albums. Some of the singles and albums that had the biggest change because of
Well,
that.
albums, not much change in albums. The albums pretty much stayed the same, but a couple changed, like Hard Day's Night went from 12 to 8. Not a huge change.
Hmm.
Double Fantasy.
Bear in mind, Hard Day's Night, United Artists, A Hard Day's
Right.
Night from
Yes.
1964.
Right. This is the
Yeah.
original, the
Yeah.
one that had all the soundtrack songs on it and everything else, but mostly the albums pretty much stayed very close. There's nothing that really jumped out as a huge, huge change. I mean, some even fell. And Beatles 65 went up one, and Magical Mystery Tour went down one. So it's not a huge big difference. Band on the Run dropped out of the top 10, so it was at number 11 now. But other than that, no, albums not much change, even when you give them the points. Mostly because albums have so many points to begin with because they're on for such a long time. I think that probably has something to do with it.
But an album like All Things Must Pass, which was number 1 for 7 weeks, got a lot more bonus points. An album like Wings at the Speed of Sound, which was also number 1 for 7 weeks, would have gotten more more bonus
True.
points. So weren't they affected?
Not really. All Things Must Pass went from 28 to 24, so only up 4 notches.
Okay.
Spinning the Pound went from 26 to 21. So with the albums, it didn't really make as much of a difference. The singles are where they made the difference. So yeah, I was surprised too. I thought I'd see more of a change, but no, there really wasn't that much change in the albums.
And also, if I didn't point this out in our previous show for all of our viewers, you might be surprised how certain albums did, like the Beatles Story, for
Yeah.
example, which you might think, could that have even gone top 10? Well, yeah, when you're in the hottest band in the world at that point, anything that they put out was doing well. I shouldn't
Yeah.
say everything, but when you look at the VJ albums introducing the Beatles did so well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So,
And it's way up there on my chart, and because it's at number 22. Actually, it dropped from 20 to 22, but yes, it's still in the, still doing quite well. I mean, when you consider it did better than Red Rose Speedway, that tells you something.
yeah, but you'll get introducing the Beatles ranking this high, and yet you won't get Please Please Me,
Yeah.
Which is the album that reflects.
Well, because Please Please Me was not released in America until 1980 or 1990 or something, on CD.
1987 when the CD.
87, thank you, yes.
Yeah. All right, so what were the biggest changes in the singles? Just highlight a few of those.
Yeah, in the singles, some of those songs that stayed at number 1 for a long time, like Ebony and Ivory, went from number 9 to number 4. So that was a pretty jump for that one. I Want to Hold Your Hand went from 16 to 5.
Good.
So that it shows, in a sense, this shows better what the impact really was. Because, I Want to Hold Your Hand certainly should not be at number 16 if you ask me, but, that's the way it was under the way I did it. Silly Love Songs went from 11 to 6. My Sweet Lord jumped from 21 to 10. Get Back went from 32 to 12, because it was number 1 for like 5 weeks, if I remember correctly.
Right, 5 weeks.
Yep. And other than that, not a huge. We Can Work It Out got from 39 to 22. Yesterday, I mentioned earlier. Other than that, no. Oh, I Feel Fine, 48 to 28. Yeah, so these songs that zoomed up the charts, got to number 1, and then zoomed back down again were really low on my chart before I did this new way of looking at things. Can't Buy Me Love went from 60 to 29. Because that was one that's like it spent half of its career at number 1. It was only on the charts for like 10 weeks, and 5 of them were at number 1. So yeah, they're giving it points for number 1 definitely does make a difference on a lot of these things. Some of them not as much. Hello Goodbye went from 49 to 44, for instance. It's not a huge, big change.
Well, I'm glad for all these changes because, I have so much of this stuff memorized. And I've done countdowns myself on the air, mixing the group and the solo together. And to me, because Ebony and Ivory was number 1 for 7 weeks, Say, Say, Say was number 1 for 6 weeks. And very often I'll find that Say, Say, Say places higher than Ebony and Ivory. And that doesn't make any sense to me. But Say, Say, Say was on the charts longer than Ebony and Ivory.
Exactly. That's the key. Yeah, even under this rearrangement, Say, Say, Say is still number 2 on my chart, even with given the extra points. Ebony and Ivory, of course, zoomed up to 4, but so Say, Say, Say had a huge impact because it stayed around forever.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you tabulated all this information because it always baffled me why in the 60s things were so different and why singles had such a short shelf life. I don't understand it. I know that certainly in 1964, there was that barrage of Beatles singles all coming at you all at once. But I can't believe that people were tired of them by 10 weeks, that they would fall off the charts, or 11 weeks. Yeah. It's I don't fully understand that myself. But,
well, like I said, they were basing it mostly on radio play in those days, and DJs would get tired of it and look for the next thing to come along, whereas people were still buying it, obviously, because in the 70s, they stayed on longer because they paid more attention to sales than they did on radio play. And I think had they done their charts differently, well, we talked about that in the last show. I don't want to repeat everything. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So let's move on here and talk about your 5 favorite Beatles albums. And we're going by the core catalog, everything from Please Please Me through Let It Be. And so these are your 5 favorites. We'll go from 5 to number 1. And I'm very curious to find out why you place these way up there and explain why. Number 5.
Sure. I don't think my chart's going to be, my list is going to be that much different from what a lot of people's lists are, but I always surprise. I mean, I don't have any big surprises here, I don't think. Number 5 is going to be A Hard Day's Night. I thought that
Okay.
was a wonderful album because it was the first album with nothing but Lennon McCartney songs on it at a time when they were just so overworked and they could come up with all these genius songs. I mean, they were, you know, there's like half of the album should be on the greatest hits collection. You know, there's just so many good songs on that album, and I you can't ignore it. Of all the early albums, that's my favorite early album, is A Hard Day's Night.
Well, you know, when I listen to it, and I say this about all the Beatles music, because I'm not caught up in the whole this sounds dated or of its time kind of thing. But A Hard Day's Night, of all the early stuff, just sounds the freshest to me. It just leaps off the stereo when you hear all this stuff. And yeah, a lot of it's because it's up tempo stuff and rockers and everything. But you've got two of the greatest ballads in their catalog with "And I Love Her" and "If I Fell."
Exactly.
So you mix that with everything else. And, you know, I even find that for me personally, many of the songs when I grew up with that were my least favorites, I've really grown to like now. And especially with A Hard Day's Night, When I Get Home is in that category because I never cared for it as a kid. And now I love it.
I don't necessarily love it, but it's a good song. I mean, there were many times when I just got and I was like, oh, geez. And then you're right. I got to appreciate it a lot more over the years. It would not be on my list of favorite Beatles songs of all time, but in the scheme of Hard Day's Night, it's not bad. You know, you know what I mean. It's compared to the other ones, it's not as good. But I certainly don't skip it. Let's put it that way. When the album's playing.
Oh yeah. Well, you know, when you've got so many other great songs, it's kind of not fair when you just say it's not as good as the others,
Right.
because the others are so great anyway. But yeah, and a few detours in their music, doing things that are different. I'll Be Back is definitely very different, and an odd way to end an album.
Yeah,
In a way.
yeah. But you know, the title works.
Oh
There'll be
yeah. Oh,
another
yeah.
album, folks.
Okay. We'll be back.
Yeah, we'll be back.
Okay. What would be your number 4 choice?
Oh boy, now it's starting to get more difficult as we go up higher. But number 4, I'm going to say, is Rubber Soul. Another one with so many great songs on it, you just can't, you know, turn them down. Once more, they could have released singles of half of the album, and it would have been big successes. And you know, if you get the Red album, you know, the 62 to 66, you know, there's a lot of Rubber Soul songs on there. Mind you, I wish there were some more Revolver songs on there, but
True.
I don't deny any of the Rubber Soul songs that made it. They would deserve to be on that collection. And there's a reason, you know, the other thing about Rubber Soul, I mean, historically, it just pushed them in a direction that made all the other bands go, what the, oh my God, you know, how are we going to compete with this? You know, one of the things I admire about the Beatles, and I said in the book, is that they never rested on their laurels. It would have been so easy to just keep making the same music all the time, like the Beach Boys kind of did for a while until they started breaking away too. Or, I don't know, Moody Blues, you know, their sound was the same all the way through their career. They never tried to do anything different. They were very good at what they did, but the Beatles never rested on their laurels. They could have kept singing, you know, She Loves You, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah forever, and probably still had hits, you know, but they pushed the rest of the music ahead, and the rest of the music had to follow them, you know.
Oh, you don't think the Moody Blues music changed from, say, the Denny Lane days to?
Oh, from the Denny Lane days. Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. I'm thinking more.
Okay.
Yeah. The more, yeah, the early, you know, Go Now stuff was definitely different from later. I will agree with that. Sorry. I'm speaking off the top of my head, you know, and probably should have thought about that statement more. I wish I could think of a good example of a band that really never changed. I mean, the Rolling Stones in some ways still sounds like the Rolling Stones today as they did back then, but they also experimented. You know, that's the point, you know, so every time I say that, I think of an exception. All right.
Well, you know, one of the beautiful things that we bring up in all the podcast shows that I do is, you know, the evolution of the group and how much they grew from album to album. And it's not like all of a sudden, here's Rubber Soul. They had songs that were not all happy-go-lucky love songs. I love you and you love me, and she loves you and from me to you and all that. But, you know, you got No Reply, I'm a Loser, and Babies in Black to kick off Beatles for Sale.
Yes.
Those are dark songs in a way, you know, things not going well in their relationships. So those kind of paved the way for more complicated songs lyrically.
Yeah, well,
telling the
Rubber Soul,
story.
you start getting things like Norwegian Wood, which is, you know, poetic in a way that the early Beatles songs weren't, you know,
Right.
and a little more of an adult relationship as opposed to Baby, I Want to Hold Your Hand and Dance with You, you know, and they were growing as adults and they were writing adult songs.
And I also think that, you know, because, well, Yesterday was such an important song in their catalog, in the sense that the Beatles are always trying to, in their own way, I think, were they really self-conscious about this? I think so. I think Brian Epstein was too, in trying to also attract the older demographic in a way, kind of why they put Till There Was You and the Ed Sullivan Show and all that.
Yeah, exactly.
And when they put out Yesterday, a lot of the older generation there was saying, you know, they're pretty good. You know, so now you got a song like Michelle, which was covered so much, you know, especially at that time
too.
Yeah. So getting more widespread appeal, I think, gradually with their albums. And you know, such a monumental step with Rubber Soul, the first really big leap. And then I think Revolver was possibly the biggest leap. It was.
Yeah.
You know, Sgt. Pepper and Revolver are similar in a lot of ways, but I'm sure Revolver is probably somewhere in that top three.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah. Sgt. Pepper is one that, oh, anyway, we'll get to that.
Okay.
That's a hard one because half of that I absolutely love, and the other half I like, but I like the other ones better. So anyway, we'll get
okay. What's number 3 then?
Number 3 is the White Album. There's just so much on there that's so much fun, and they really just show that they could write any kind of music you could think of. You know, there's rock and roll songs, there's a heavy metal song, there's Hollywood blues, you know, there's whatever Revolution 9 is. You know, they did whatever they wanted to do, and shows how talented they were, and I just love it. You know, and you don't get. I just trying to imagine what it was like when that album came out and people had no idea what they were getting, because there's, you know, no indication on the cover, and they pull it off and it's just one great song after another. That must have been, you know, mind-blowing. I remember when I got that album. Can I tell you a quick story about that? I'm in high school, and, you know, I'm a poor kid. I can hardly afford to buy any Beatle albums, and my friend is also a Beatle fan, and he goes out and somehow for a birthday present he gets the White Album. And he comes to school the next day and says, look what I got. I got the Beatles White Album. Here are the songs on it. And, you know, back in those days, they didn't play album cuts on the radio. There was no internet. I had no way of knowing. And he showed me the song list. The Continuing Story of Bungalow Bill, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Wild Honey Pie, Piggies. And I'm going, you made these up. Beatles didn't write a song called While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Give me a break. You know, I didn't believe him. I thought he had made it all up. Right. But then he made a copy for me, and I fell in love with him, obviously. It's a wonderful album and just shows their creativity. You know, and if I can talk about song titles for a minute. I wrote a book about the Monkees as well. And one of the things I criticized from some of the later Monkees albums is that if you read the song titles, they're all so boring. Midnight, Baby, I Love You, and whatever. You know, they're songs titles that anyone could think of. There's no way you'd look at a Beatles album, read the titles, and go, this is boring. You'd go, those are interesting titles. I bet they're good songs. You know, and that to me is an important thing when you're writing a song, is don't just say the same thing everyone always says. You know, there's too many Baby, I Love You songs. And the Beatles never fell to that, at least I don't think. You know, maybe a little bit at the early days, but as they grew as musicians and writers, they didn't want to do that anymore. And that's, you really see that on the White Album.
Now, Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except Me and My Monkey. That's too typical a title. That's
exactly. I saw, by the way, they did a concert tour a couple of years ago. Mickey Dolenz and Todd Rundgren and
I was there.
Oh yeah, me too. And when they played Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except for Me and My Monkey, Todd Rundgren singing it, and Mickey Dolenz comes out and looks at him like, "Are you talking to me, monkey?"
Yeah. Well, you know, I've often said, and people who have followed my work know, that I love the Beatles for a lot of reasons, but for so many artists, I appreciate the ones that have the most eclectic tastes. Yeah. And the Beatles are, you know, and certainly McCartney as a solo artist is just as top as you can get in that category. And the White Album, as well as that album I just mentioned, Revolver, certainly reflects that. There's so many different genres of music on the White Album. And as I've said many times, to go from Helter Skelter to Honey Pie, you know, 180 degrees.
Exactly.
Yeah, but I mean, like you said, there's all kinds of music on there. You got folk music, you got blues, like your blues.
Yep.
You know, I even think like Savoy Truffle and Happiness is a Warm Gun has blues elements in it too.
Hmm.
Obla Da has reggae in it.
Yep.
You know, all out rockers like Birthday.
And then you have Good Night, which is like you know, a lullaby, basically. You know, it's like everything. It's really wonderful.
Yeah.
You know what I really would have liked though, and this is just me. I kind of wish they hadn't put Revolution 9 on there. I thought that should have gone on one of John's solo albums, and they had put Hey Jude in there instead. Because can you imagine if Hey Jude and it builds and it fades, and then suddenly in comes Good Night afterwards? I thought it would have fit perfectly. It's approximately the same length. That would have been a wonderful way to end the album. I'm not a big fan of Revolution 9.
Oh, well, there are some people who really appreciate it for what
Oh,
it
I know.
was. And, you know, it's so
What
far
I
out of
do,
left field for its
I do
time.
admire the fact that they did it. Let's put it that way. The fact that they were
Right.
willing to experiment and said, we're going to do something different, and here's what we're doing. I just don't really listen to it, is what I'm saying, you know?
What interests me about that is that McCartney at that time was into
Yeah,
avant-garde and backwards tapes, and yet he was very self-conscious about the Beatles image, and he
right.
allowed that to go on the White Album, even though it was mainly John and Yoko, and George Harrison helped out a little bit with that. But he's so image conscious that I would have seen him making that a B-side or something rather than putting it on the album.
Yeah.
So I think it was very courageous of the Beatles in general to put Revolution number 9 on there. And I'm someone who just feels like, you know, just about everything the Beatles did was right. You know, I mean, some people will disagree with me.
Mhm.
We're all entitled to their opinions.
But like I said, you know, I admire them for doing it, but if I'm listening to the album, I don't want to listen to that. You know, that's what I mean. Maybe every few years I'll listen to it and put the headphones on just for the hell of it. But it's not like, you know, something I play in the car when I'm driving, you know, like I would the rest of the album.
Now, on the one hand, we admire the group for being as eclectic and doing all these different styles of music. But then there are some fans who feel, like George Martin said, it should have been trimmed down to one album and just put the best songs on there. And that sometimes when you're doing all this other stuff, Revolution number 9, Wild Honey Pie,
Mhm.
maybe Piggies or things like I love Piggies because of the harpsichord
Yeah.
classical element to it.
That's my problem.
Um,
If I had to narrow it down to one album, I don't know if I could, you know? There's just too many good songs. I have no problem with it being a double album. You know, if they had cut, I don't know. No, the thing about a lot of double albums, like, you know, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, is once they come out with CDs, they could still fit on a CD, or, you know, the Clash's, you know, London Calling. It still fit on one CD. White Album is so long, you could not fit it on one CD, even with modern CD technology. It's a very long album. They could have cut a little bit and made it fit on a CD, but I don't want them to do that either, you
no.
know? But you
So
get your money's worth of that album, that's for sure. I mean, each side's like 25 minutes long, you know?
right.
You get your money's worth of that album.
There are some fans that feel that, you know, you have this aspect of, and this creeps into what people complain about the solo music, this idea of overindulgence. You know, did you feel that way when it came to the White Album? I guess not, because you love everything on there except Revolution number 9.
Yeah, really. No, I don't. I feel like it's a great treat. There's just so much to enjoy, you know, that I didn't have any problem with. There's, I don't know if there's such a thing as too much Beatles.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah,
All right.
you know, I kind of wish they would release. I did a blog post about. I wish they could release all the albums and put all the different singles and B-sides that weren't on the albums in the proper place. You know, like I'd love to have a Rubber Soul CD that also has We Can Work It Out, you know, on it, and Day Tripper, you know, because they were recorded around the same time.
I
Um,
know, but that's not how they envisioned it.
no, I know. At least with the remixes, they're putting some of the songs back on. You know, Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields was with the Sgt. Pepper re-release, for instance. You know, I kind of like that.
Right. It's another fascinating aspect in the Beatles' history is how they viewed singles and albums as
Yeah.
separate entities. But of course, there were exceptions to the rules, especially when it came to the movies.
Yeah.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
A Hard Day's Night and Can't Buy Me Love came out of A Hard Day's Night anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Ticket
Yep.
to Ride and Help came out of Help.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, what was your number 2 choice?
Well, my number 2 choice is what you might expect, which is Revolver.
Okay.
Revolver is, to me, the album that should have gotten the attention that Sgt. Pepper later got. And I always wondered if they had made an attempt to package it the same way they packaged Sgt. Pepper, if it would have gotten as much attention, and people would be looking at Revolver as the great Beatles album like they looked at Sgt. Pepper. Do you know what I mean? It would have been more of a cultural thing, I think, because the album is certainly as good. There's no bad songs on it, and it's such a step forward from Revolver. I mean, from Rubber Soul. There's just starting off with Taxman, which is just a wonderful song that's different, and starting off with the George song, which they'd never done before, and then going right into Eleanor Rigby. You're in for a treat. Things are different. And then from Eleanor Rigby, they go into Love You Too. It's like, oh my God, they're showing you all the skills they have up front. It's amazing, and the album just gets better from there. And ending with Tomorrow Never Knows, which is one of my favorite Beatles tracks ever, one of my top psychedelic influenced so many people. When people talk about how influential Sgt. Pepper was, I don't know. I mean, a lot of the stuff that's from Sgt. Pepper was already done in Revolver in some ways, right, just more so in Sgt. Pepper. So to me, Revolver is the album that really pushed the Beatles into their adult phase, if you know what I mean. To be sort of this is when we're no longer the four mop tops. If they had grown mustaches and posed like Sgt. Pepper for the cover of Revolver, I think that would be the album people would be saying is the Beatles album, like sometimes people say about Sgt. Pepper.
Interesting. Very often I've brought up the fact that in radio, especially in classic rock radio, there's this division of music from 1967 on and everything before 1967. 1967 is looked at as the year when it was the birth of the album as an art form, which is ridiculous because all the Beatles albums before Sgt. Pepper were all great all the way through. But it's interesting what you said there about the packaging of Revolver. I think, let me ask you, do you think that Yellow Submarine being released as a single, despite the fact that it was #2 in the US, #1 in the UK, and also having Eleanor Rigby, great song, didn't chart nearly as high as it should have as a double-sided hit, but a double-sided hit in the UK, that maybe that hurt Revolver in a way because Revolver is so all over the place. There's so much experimentation on there, and the main single that you're pushing is a children's song. Granted, it's a sing-along song. Everybody knows it.
It is a kind of an unusual song to pick for a single from an album that has so many songs that could. I mean, if they had released, I'm trying to think now. I'm going back and forth about which one would have been a better release.
There's
Not to Get You to My Life, I think probably would have been a bigger hit, and it was later released like 10 years later.
Right.
But that probably is a little more radio friendly, I guess I should say, at the time. That might have been a better single pick. I don't know. I hadn't thought about it until you mentioned it.
Well, I certainly can hear, Anya Burke Sing, which is a moot point because it was on yesterday and today here anyway.
Yeah.
But I mean, that would have made a strong single if Revolver came out the same way here.
Right. One of the problems with American Revolver is they had cut three of John's songs and put them on yesterday and today.
Right.
So the American version of Revolver, it was completely different and a lot more Paul heavy.
Right.
And in America, so we didn't really get the good full feel of what Revolver really is, because it needs John's songs in there as a balance. And I think the British version is so much better.
Yeah, a few times I've said that because Yesterday and Today came out before Revolver and it had those 3 Lennon songs on there, and you've got psychedelic stuff in there with I'm Only Sleeping, maybe the departure going from Yesterday and Today into Revolver wasn't as radical as it was in the UK going from Rubber Soul to Revolver.
That's a good point, and that also made Revolver not as big of a, to people listening to it, it wasn't that big of a change. Yeah, you're right, because we'd already heard those songs like 3 months earlier. Yeah. Okay, that might be why it wasn't as looked at in the same way that Sgt. Pepper tends to be looked at in the rearview mirror.
I'm just trying to come up with reasons for it, because now Now, thankfully, Revolver is so respected, and then in a lot of surveys, it's ranked as number one.
Yeah.
And believe me, if Sergeant Pepper is still number one, I'm not going to complain about it because it's such an amazing album.
It is. It is.
Which leads me to your number one album.
My number one album is Abbey Road.
Okay.
I have always loved that. I constantly play it. I never get tired of it. There's always something new I can hear in it. And there's just no bad songs on it. And it's also a lot better produced and better sounding than the other albums. Although now that they're doing the remixes, the other ones sound very good too. But even from the beginning, it was just a wonderful album to listen to with the headphones on. And I just, I never get tired of it. The first time I got it, here, I'll tell you a quick funny story though. The first time I got it, once more, I was a kid and a friend of mine recorded it for me and he put it on a 45 cassette, or so a 90-minute cassette. Each side is 45 minutes. So we recorded it all to be on one side. So when I got it and I was listening to it, it's playing and it's at the end and you hear Ringo's drum solo and it just stops. And I thought for a long time, that's how the album ended. Because the tape ran out. Because the album is longer than 45 minutes. And so it wasn't until I got the album a little while later, I went, oh, there's more to it to this. And I didn't get here. Her Majesty, was stuck on at the end, and I didn't know about that either. So for a long time as a kid, I thought the album ended with Ringo's drum solo.
That sounds like what a lot of people experience when they played 8-tracks for certain.
Yeah. Oh, I never bought an 8-track because I could not stand the fact that they remixed the songs in different orders and cut them in the middle. So I said, "There's no way I'm buying that," and I never did. Yeah, I had some standards. It's just a wonderful album with so many great songs on it, so well produced, and I just never get tired of it. In some ways, I always thought it'd be interesting if they had started the album off with "You Never Give Me Your Money." Had that been the opening song, moved like one of the songs on side one to side two. And the reason for that is that when you have the reprise at the very end of the album, it would have sort of tied the album together in the same way that Sgt. Pepper had its reprise at the end. So when at the end, I think that might have been very interesting to listen to. And I always wondered every once in a while, I imagining rearranging it in my head like that.
Never thought about that before, but hey, I mean, it happened on Sgt. Pepper. Happened later with Band on the Run, bringing that back at the end of the album.
It just makes the whole album feel like a cohesive whole instead of just a medley on side two, just a thought.
It's such a marvelous record. I could say that about all the Beatles albums, but I love the contrast between side one and side two. 6 separate songs on side one, and many of them are so different. Maxwell Silverhammer and I Want You, She's So Heavy. And
yes,
I love the contrast. Some people only like the rockers. I like the whole mixture of everything that they did, but for me,
I even like Maxwell Silverhammer. I'm sorry, some people can't stand that song, but I like it.
I always liked it. And as a matter of fact, I would even go so far as to say that could have been a single.
That's what Paul wanted, of course. But at the time, he was arguing with Alan Klein, and Alan Klein said, "No, I'm going to give a single to John and George, and you're not getting on the singles at all."
Okay, but I really think it was catchy enough. It could have worked on AM radio, and for all the people who are critical of that song, I could have heard it as a hit.
Yeah,
but then again, I could have heard "Here Comes the Sun" as a hit. And,
"Here Comes the Sun" is definitely should have been a single. In some ways, it wasn't until like "Let It Be" that they released like 3 singles off of that album. That's the only album I can think of that has 3 singles off of it. But Abbey Road could have easily had another single coming off it. They could have put "Here Comes the Sun." It would have been interesting having 2 George singles in a row like that. But "Here Comes the Sun" is like, if you look at what Beatles songs are being downloaded, that's like number 1 and number 2. People download that, love that song.
Yeah, it is the number 1 most downloaded Beatles song, and it just reached on Spotify 1 billion streams. It's something I love to talk about with Beatle fans is why that particular song. I mean, it's nothing against it. There's so many great Beatles songs. You could have told me "Let It Be" is the most downloaded Beatles song, but "Here Comes the Sun," one Beatle fan wrote to me saying it's because it can fit into so many thematic sets and playlists and everything, whatever your theme is.
That's true.
A morning song, a sun song,
an optimistic song. Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
it works on so many levels. If it's winter time and the ice is melting, right, there you go. That's the perfect song.
Oh,
But I just think that the medleys on side 2 are just one of the many miracles that you'll find with the Beatles and how they all flowed together so well. What is it about these songs that are conceived as individual songs, and somehow in the end they all blend together as a medley?
and what's interesting is that they originally, like, Her Majesty was stuck in the middle there.
Right.
They cut that out. So at one point it wasn't really working as a medley. I'm glad they cut that out. It sounds much better without it, obviously.
Yeah.
It just, they made it all work. They didn't even record some of them together. It's amazing. They just spliced them together and it all worked.
Well, they recorded 2 songs together at a time. And yeah, but I think that it's such a rare talent that people don't talk about enough, when you can put together unfinished songs and have them flow together so well, which McCartney does better than anybody. Many of his songs that you think was all written at once are separate pieces strung together.
Oh yeah, Uncle Albert Halsey, he's done a lot of songs like that where he mixes parts together, or the medley in Red Rose Speedway too. He just takes all these songs, and then at the end of Red Rose Speedway, you hear the themes from all those songs playing in the background as it's fading out. He's very good about that kind of stuff. Absolutely.
Okay.
When John did that with Happiness Is a Warm Gun too, those are all different.
Exactly. Yeah. When John was critical of Paul for doing that with unfinished songs, he didn't point out that Happiness Is a Warm Gun was the same thing. Yeah. One question: no Sgt. Pepper in here.
I had trouble. I told you it was very difficult trying to come up with these. Sgt. Pepper has, A Day in the Life. It has the Sgt. Pepper. It has Lucy in the Sky. It has Getting Better. I mean, there's so many good songs on there, but I could only pick 5. Something had to be number 6. Something had to be number 7. It just didn't quite make it. On sometimes A Day in the Life would sort of overshadow everything else and make me go, well, maybe I'll put it on there just because of A Day in the Life. But I was looking at the album as a whole and which ones do I listen to more and more, and didn't quite make my top 5.
Yeah.
But, they can't all be in the top 5. Something has to be cut.
And as I've said with my co-hosts on the different podcasts, your taste could change all the time, and your number 1 album could change
absolutely
from year to year. So
if I could list collections and things, I would have the Yellow Submarine songbook on here, because those are some of my favorite era of the Beatles, is the psychedelic era and all the songs in that, and the remixed versions of Hey Bulldog, and finally hearing Only a Northern Song in complete stereo is just wonderful. So I really love that album. The remix version of Nowhere Man, where the voices are all around you.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I'm looking forward to when they can do that on the rest of River Soul. But that is one of my favorite albums to just put on and listen to all the way through. But it's not an official, original Beatle album, I should say. It's a collection, so it's a little bit different.
Maybe there's some way I can put together a countdown on my shows here of say Beatles anthology on. what are your favorites? But then I guess you have to keep the archival box sets different.
Oh yeah, but would you count all the ones that aren't available anymore, like rarities, or love songs, or those
music and real music and 20
all the ones that aren't available anymore too,
Yeah, those are exciting times to me, especially in the 70s, getting those compilations, even though I had the music anyway. It was a different way of presenting the music, and I wanted the Beatles on the charts.
Well, what I liked about the rock and roll collection is that they actually remixed them, which was wonderful. So it was the first time I knew that they could do that. So all the vocals weren't on one side and all the instruments were on the other side for some of those early songs. I kept hoping they would do that again. So far, they haven't really done that. I hope it's on their list. I guess next they're working on Rubber Soul, I guess, and hope they'll keep going.
I suppose that's what's next. Everyone is thinking that's what's next.
Well, Magical Mystery Tour could be done too, still,
Well, they haven't done Magical Mystery Tour on Yellow Submarine, which I thought they would do.
They could mix them together. There's only a few new songs, if they did them both together, that'd be very nice.
Well, I just remember when Sgt. Pepper came out, the box set, that they intentionally left out Only a Northern Song and All Together Now. And I'm trying to think, It's All Too Much was also done before Sgt.
Correct.
Pepper came out.
Yep.
Only Hey Bulldog was later in February
Mhm.
'68. So, you know, that should
Yeah,
be a clue that they're doing something with those songs.
I certainly
So,
hope so. Again,
yeah,
a remix, because they've already put out Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever,
right.
So if they put out a new Magical Mystery Tour, they could theoretically leave those off and replace them with some of the Yellow Submarine songs, and maybe the earlier version of Across the Universe too.
Hmm. Okay. Hey, the more they put on, the happier I'll be.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Michael, it's great to have you back. This is the
Thank you.
name of his book, The Beatles on the Charts. Anything you wanted to know about Beatles and solo Beatles, singles and albums on the Billboard charts in America, you'll find in this book.
And if you don't like the way I put them together, all the information is there for you to make your own charts.
Okay. Thanks so much, Michael. Thanks to
Thanks for having
all
me
of
on.
you for watching, and we'll see you next time.